So this week's Parsha Miketz starts with Paro's dreams and Yosef's lightning-fast rise from prisoner in a dungeon to viceroy of Egypt with control of the entire country. I'd like to talk about somewhat of a continuation of the thought of last week and extend it a little further. Last week's punchline was Yosef's living a fully authentic life where he had fully purified himself and was internally perfect. He then tried to align and connect his perfect inner self with his outer world, and this process of living authentically from the inside out is what made him the Yesod, the foundation in the Sphirot constellation, and really the foundation of our faith, and what made him the Redeemer that travels ahead and prepares the way for his family. And in our time, what the Mashiach ben Yosef does for the nation, he prepares the way. This is Yosef's strength, and this is the power that he brought to our people. He's the force that travels ahead and prepares the way for us. So there's a theme that runs through Yosef's story that's really hard to overlook. The involvement of clothing, both Yosef's interest in clothing and his care in grooming and dressing himself, as well as his clothing being ripped from him violently. This happened multiple times. Last week's Parsha starts with Yaakov dressing Yosef in the Ksonat Pasim, the multicolored cloak signifying his superiority over his brothers, and the subsequent stripping of this cloak from Yosef violently when his brothers threw him in the pit. In the incident with Potiphar's wife, she grabs him by his cloak and he leaves it in her hand and runs outside. In the space of 4 or 5 sentences, psukim, the Torah mentions that he left the cloak in her hand 4 times. This is the equivalent of the Torah hitting us over the head with a baseball bat with this point. The Torah doesn't repeat itself, not in one extra letter. To mention the same fact 4 times in 4 psukim is really unheard of, that he left his cloak, that she was holding his cloak in her hand. It's also very hard to not see a parallel between these 2 episodes, spaced so closely in the narrative, in the same parsha, almost next to each other. Both of them mentioning cloaks that are stripped from his body violently. And although not spelled out, I think it's implicit in the narrative that Yosef's cloak in Potiphar's house was also very distinctively that of a Hebrew, an Ivri, for 2 reasons I think this. First, one, that she held the cloak and showed it multiple times to separate people. If this was a standard, non-unique piece of clothing, like a butler's uniform, a tuxedo, it wouldn't have so much dramatic value for her to use it theatrically in this manner, because everyone wears the same thing. What's she waving around? And second, from the way she referred to him dramatically as a Hebrew to the other servants, and it being clear that he wasn't at all embarrassed to act like one. In all of his conversations that he has with Potiphar, with the king, with Paro, with the Sarah Ophim, with the Sarah Mashkim, he's always talking about God, 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 in all of his statements. So it makes sense that he remained wearing the clothing of an Ivri, distinctive indeed in Egypt. So this was very distinctive clothing. It makes sense now that Potiphar's wife was waving around this Jew clothing, and getting the servants riled up against the Jew. And then in this week's Parsha, when Paro summons Yosef from the dungeon, the Torah says they rushed him out of the dungeon. They rushed him out. But then it says he shaved and changed his clothing and came to Paro. There was no rushing. There was no mention of rushing. It seems to me from reading the sentence and how it flows from them rushing him out is, yes, they rushed him out of the dungeon, but then he took his time shaving and changing his clothing and coming to Paro, calmly. He took time to dress and groom himself. He took his time. And presumably, if he put on his own clothing, he dressed as a Hebrew again, which was his signature look. And it's not like he was embarrassed. He told Paro right by the dreams, it's not me, it's God. So, and then when Paro made him the viceroy, the Torah says he was dressed in clothing of fine linen, among other things that it says. But in one short story of maybe a few hours between being rushed out of the dungeon until he became the viceroy, he had 2 changes of clothing. And that the Torah mentions both of these changes of clothing. It's hard to overlook, that this theme. And then in next week's Parsha, where he already reveals himself to his brothers, and they're going back to Yaakov in Eretz Yisrael, He gives his brothers a change of clothing, among other things like food and provisions for the way home to their father, but he also gives them changes of clothing. And his brother Binyamin, he gives 5 changes of clothing to, underscoring to his brothers as well as, therefore, to us, that a change of clothing here is metaphorical as well as practical. If it was only about, here you go, here's a pair of clothing, here's a suit of clothing, for the road, because you're not going to be able to wash your clothing. So why is he giving Binyamin 5 sets and the rest of them only 1 set? Clearly, there's a more of a meaning here than just, you're not going to have a cleaners on the way, so have an extra pair of pants. That's not what this was about. This was clearly a more significant event and a more significant meaning. So what's up with Yosef and clothing? We also know the Medrash that God sicked Potiphar's wife on Yosef. The Medrash calls it God waking up the bear, referring to her as the bear, and God like poking at her because Yosef took time to groom himself excessively while his father was mourning for him. This seems like an odd pastime for the only man the Torah calls a tzaddik during his lifetime, to be busy grooming himself and excessive involvement with his clothing and his hair. It just seems, it just doesn't make sense. Another thing that, not going to get into now, but to say more about the importance of clothing, we know the first set of clothing was created literally by God for Adam HaRishon. After he sinned, God gave him clothing. God made clothing and clothed him. This was a very, so clothing is clearly a very, very important, significant idea in addition to actually covering our nakedness. Another famous question, very, very famous question, is why did Yosef not reach out to his father over the 22 years he was in Egypt? Very famous question. It's an obvious question, especially after he became viceroy. You want to say while he was a slave, even then it's a problem. But once he was king, he was king for a while before they showed up. Even then he didn't reach out to his father. The answer given is that the brothers made a pact to not tell their father, and Yosef was honoring that pact. So even assuming that they made him promise this before removing him from the pit, and even understanding Yosef's loyalty and faithfulness to all those around him, including his brothers, I still don't get it. Yosef owed his father more loyalty than he owed his brothers, and if it was just a question of honoring a promise he made under duress while they were trying to kill him when they threw him in the pit, then he should have given them up and reached out to his father. And we see that he had more loyalty to his father than his brothers because he told on his brothers to his father all the time. So it's not like he was against, ratting his brothers out to his father. So why would he, even if they made him promise this, why would he stick to this promise? Why would he feel the need to stick to this promise? So I think what's going on is as follows. Yaakov gives Yosef the special cloak, symbolizing his moral superiority, as well as his senior place in the family, and also as a protection from exterior forces, which he needs due to his purity. This, that he's first among equals, was bad enough as far as his brothers were concerned, but they were fine with this, that he was first among equals. They were fine that the father loved him more. It seems to me it would be obvious if the Torah calls him a tzaddik, his brothers must have known that he was a cut above them in terms of spiritual purity. If the father saw it and the father gave him the cloak, I'm sure the brothers saw it also, and they were jealous of it. But this wasn't enough to make them want to kill him or sell him. What happened was then Yosef had the dreams, and during the dreams he told them, "I'm going to be your king. I'm going to be your master. You're going to bow to me." Now he's no longer the first among equals. Now he's saying, "I'm the boss of you guys," and this is something that they didn't agree with. They didn't agree. They felt that all the shvatim were equal, even if one was better than the others in different ways. But fundamentally, they're equal tribes. And here Yosef is telling them, "No, we're not equal. I'm the king." And they didn't agree with that. They felt that Yosef was taking the idea of the Ksonat Pasim too far. They felt that Yosef was a little too full of himself, and that Yaakov's favoritism now resulted in Yosef going overboard and being delusional. So Yosef, on the other hand, sees his dreams as prophecy and his destiny, and he feels it's their need. They need to know it. So when they throw him in the pit, they strip him of this special cloak and they say to him, we interpreted it sarcastically. Let's see what happens with his dreams now. But I think it wasn't just sarcastic. I think they were challenging him. This was pushback. They were telling him, get rid of the cloak, do it on your own. Don't be daddy's favorite anymore. You say that you're the king. You say that we're going to bow to you. Prove it to us on your own. You want to be more than us? Go out there and make something of yourself, and we'll bow to you. But so far all you are is a little kid that his father gave him a pretty sweater and runs to his father and rats us out about stuff. So you want to do that? That's fine. We'll throw you in a pit. We'll sell you as a slave. We'll strip you of the cloak and let's see you be the king. So Yosef understood that for him to fulfill this destiny and be their king, he would have to do it on his own, according to their terms, without running to daddy and without relying on his father's protective cloak. He, in effect, took them up on their challenge, and he said he'll show them what he's made of. He didn't reach out to his father over the 22 years because this would have been cheating on the challenge. He knew he had to make good on his destiny without his father's help. When Yosef comes to Egypt and becomes a slave in Potiphar's house, he starts to dress distinctively as a Hebrew, with a strong focus on his appearance, as someone completely pure and beautiful on the inside, who is meant to externalize this perfection and show it to the world, and thereby connect his inner spiritual self with his external physical environment. The closest material thing outside of his body, outside of our bodies, is our clothing. And he gives a lot of care and effort to this because this is really the boundary point between the internal self and the external world. The boundary point, the first point of connection between our internal self and the external world is our clothing. And he put a tremendous amount of effort to get it right, for it to represent who he was properly. We also know, people make judgments about us within seconds. I think it's 2 seconds or even 3 seconds. And it's amazing how much information people get, even their shoes. I know I learned from my mother, you want to know about someone, look at his shoes. But and actually I do that still to this day. I see that as part of the 1 second glance over. And, it's embarrassing I don't take better care of my appearance if I know these things. But the fact is that Yosef took tremendous care on his appearance, and he wanted it to reflect who he was internally, exactly who he was internally. And that's why he spends so much time, on preparing and grooming and taking care of his clothing. This may seem unusual to us, who see holiness as a removal from the physical realm. When we think of holy people, we think of, hermits, ascetics, not Hasidics, ascetics, people that are removed from physicality. This was not Yosef's holiness. Obviously, he was pure inside more than anybody in history. The Torah attests to that. But to Yosef, his holiness had to be connected to the physical realm, because that's who he was, the connector between the spiritual and physical realms. So his whole avoda was to take that physical self and expose it to the world. And he wanted to expose it in the perfect, in exactly the way it was. So Potiphar's wife grabs him by this cloak. However, Potiphar's wife grabs him by this cloak, by his connection to the physical realm, which was the place she was able to relate to him and connect to him. She only saw the physical, but we know he was beautiful. Yefei Tar, Yefei Mara. He was beautiful of appearance, beautiful in face and in body. He had a beautiful body. He was dressed beautifully. But that's what she took out of it, because she was a physical being. But she didn't see the reflection of that spiritual. But and then when she grabbed him by his cloak, he left it with her to demonstrate. Although he was connected to the physical realm, he was able to disconnect when necessary. When the connection would damage his internal values, when he was being pulled externally in that way, he cut the tie and he just went back into his shell, and he ran off because he wasn't going to allow the corruption of his internal self by the grabbing of his external clothing. And when he was able to, when removed from the prison to meet Paro, he immediately takes the time again to groom himself and dress again in his distinctive and immaculately put together Hebrew clothing. Once Paro gives him his new job as viceroy, he also gives him his kingly garb, which replaces his Hebrew clothing. Similar to how his multicolored cloak from his father also replaced his standard Hebrew clothing. Presumably, he was wearing his regular Jew clothing. His father gave him the ksonat pasum above it. Now, with Paro giving him the new clothing, he no longer wore the Hebrew clothing. He put the Paro clothing on top. This new set of clothing is now the kingly replacement for the cloak from his father. The difference is that this cloak had actually been earned. This is the kingly cloak that he had dreamed about. When he gives his brothers a change of clothing for their trip back home in next week's Parsha, it doesn't say this specifically, but I believe he gives them Hebrew clothing. We know that when the brothers came to Egypt, he accused them of being spies. If they were dressed as Hebrews, they wouldn't have been looking like spies. They came to Egypt dressed as Egyptians. That's implicit in the fact that they were assumed to be spies. They came in different gates. They were dressed like Egyptians. That's why he was able to accuse them of spying. But when they left and he gave them clothing, it seems to me that he gave them Hebrew clothing. And Yosef is reminding them of the challenge that they challenged him, said, do it on your own. And we're taking your ksonat pasum away from you. He was reminding them of that and the importance of actually keeping their dress and giving them this whole idea and saying, don't be dressed like Egyptians, dress like Hebrews. And significantly, he gives Binyamin 5 sets of clothing, not better quality clothing or different product. He didn't give him fancy clothing. It's clear from the pasuk that it's the same clothing. It's just 5 sets of the same clothing, as opposed to his father, who gave him special clothing to set him apart from his brother. He didn't give Binyamin different clothing to set him apart. He gave him 5 sets to give him extra protection, which Yosef wanted to give him because he was his full brother from his mother as well. But Yosef did not want to establish any differences between Binyamin and his brothers. I also said earlier about the 5. The 5 sets means a lot. There's no time now to talk about the meaning of 5 sets, but that's clear from this that it had meaning. I also think this event of Yosef giving this clothing to the brothers is the source of why the Jews in Egypt did not change their dress for hundreds of years that they were there. We know that during the hundreds of years that the Jews were in Mitzrayim, they didn't change their names, they didn't change their dress, and they didn't change their language. I don't know why they didn't change their names and their language, but the dress they didn't change, in my humble opinion, because they got from Yosef already. This was ingrained in them when they first came down to Egypt, and he gave them the Hebrew clothing, that this is your clothing. Even in Egypt, you wear this clothing. And this trickled down into their children and to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, this idea that they got from Yosef to keep the clothing. That's what I believe. We know the saying that the clothing makes the man, and some people dress for effect, using their clothing as an image enhancer or a projector. Clothing has this idea to it, and by putting it on, they change who they are, or they're more important, or that saying. Others, especially those that are part of a distinctive group, whether it's army or Hasidim or anyone that uses clothing as a uniform, a distinctive group, they use clothing as a uniform to identify with. It makes them part of the group. Both of these are using clothing from the outside in. Wearing something because of what it looks like on the outside makes them feel a certain way on the inside. Yosef was the opposite, and we could all learn from this. Yosef wore clothing that best projected his inner character and self to the outside world. The clothing was an expression of his inner self, and it was a way for him to connect his pure inner self with the physicality of the exterior world around him. When we dress, we should meditate on connecting our own inner world with the physical world outside of ourselves, and our ability to bring change and goodness to this world based on our own behaviors and good intentions. A funny story of my mother, many, many years ago, my grandmother, Alea Shalom, she was a Holocaust survivor. for Auschwitz, and she was niftar on Hoshana Rabbah 5 years ago. And she told my mother many years ago, when she was wearing red nail polish, no, there's no reason you need to share your true colors with the world around you. And since then, my mother, stopped sharing her true colors with the world around her and started wearing, more modest nail polish. But um, this is really the same idea, that to understand that really we should wear clothing not just as a way for us to feel something internally, but actually as a way of expressing our internal self to the exterior world, and to live in a more authentic and aligned way, and using our clothing in that way. So Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov, Chanukah Sameach from Renana, Israel.